My name is Mike. I'm a professor for social management, and you are listening to Managing Around, the podcast about social sciencing and magic managing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Creating a welcoming experience for students is one of the key challenges when starting a session. Equally important is the initiation of a virtual classroom. Studies have shown that schools and universities with a positive learning environment help students become more successful. In today's episode 13, we will talk about the community building in the virtual classroom, the activities that help to welcome your students. There are plenty of community building techniques that are already in use in traditional classrooms. These have been part of teacher education for some time now. But do not make the same mistake in using the same techniques without adaptation in your online classes, especially in this time. It is the purpose of this podcast to create a useful resource for teachers, lecturers, tutors, or other educators who need a helping hand coming to terms with this new way of teaching. So, we'll be looking at a more practical approach to designing your virtual class. Let's start with the first idea. Make your students feel welcome is the new normal. We live in an uncertain time. No matter where you're from, we all feel somewhat intimidated and worried about this pandemic. We do not know what the future will be like, how different our lives will be after all this. This is why it is important to make your students feel welcome in your class, to face sudden changes in the learning environment. It is difficult for those of us to get used to the virtual world. Not having physical contact or being close to our friends is a real challenge. It is essential to dedicate at least a few minutes in your virtual classes to explain the new online courses and the values that come with it, and how everyone can make the most of it, together with all the other participants. Let's move on to our second idea. Create a personal connection. To continue with the first point, it's crucial for virtual classrooms that students have a personal connection with one another. To make the virtual environment feel as close as possible to the real one, we need to make sure that students have a personal and emotional connection. Rachel Torr, a professor of creative writing at Eastern Washington University, recently wrote in the Chronicle an interesting article about how to use personal essays as effective tool in building relationships in a synchronous virtual classroom. In her courses, she asked students to write a personal essay, uncredited of course, and to post it on the course website, the so-called sandbox, for later discussions. In the virtual session, she divided the class into small groups, so-called breakout rooms, and asked them to comment on one another's essays in the sandbox. Over the course, those students got to know one another better by reading. Professor Torr recommends also some other things that will be helpful in every virtual and real classroom. First, allow for small group interactions. Let the shy and the reticent, as well as the dominant talkers, form their own groups to allow them all to speak. Second, let them chat during the virtual classes. Most video conferencing tools have an integrated chat functionality to let also those less inclined to speak up. Third, less is just as good or better than more. Use shorter assignments that will help to accomplish the same learning outcomes. Fourth, grades don't have to be an additional stressor. Do not penalize late work in intermediate assignments, as students often have family obligations or other work to do. Fifth, peer review is a great tool. Create a rubric for the required analytical essay or for other class assignments, so that students can give one another guided feedback. Sixth, hold regular office hours. Schedule your meetings with your students during the office hours. Seventh, email. Remote learning and virtual collaboration heavily relies on email, especially to exchange few personal words and to track those students who were lagging behind. Eighth, make all assignments due at the same time each week. Assignments should become a routine over the semester, so schedule them at a certain day and time. Ninth, identify students who are struggling early. An initial written introduction of each student will help to assess their strengths and weaknesses. 10th, give strong students more responsibility. Giving students specific tasks such as note-taking or writing recaps will help those students who missed a class, but keep in mind to balance work between students. And finally, meet at scheduled times. Be punctual. Virtual classroom collaborations do only work if all participants meet at the scheduled time. Furthermore, you can also use peer teams to lead online discussions. As Lion Rourke and Terry Anderson found in one of the earliest studies of this kind, I quote, "Students preferred the peer teams to the instructor as discussion leaders and reported that the discussions were helpful in achieving high-order learning objectives, but could have been more challenging and critical." And this is the third and last idea for today. Have some common rituals. Creating some common rituals is essential to make sure the classes will be efficient and productive for students' learning and engagement. You can achieve this by having some kind of orientation program when the course starts. The students will get a chance to get to know each other, which creates a sense of community. So let's come to the end of this podcast today. Eventually, all of these activities have roots in real-time community building. It is about creating a positive and so-called homely environment for the students to feel welcome and nurtured in a virtual environment. This is equally important in all your teaching. All right, that's it for today, dear listeners. I truly appreciate all your efforts to tune in my podcast for this episode. Please, if you liked this episode, don't forget subscribing to the podcast channel in your favorite podcast app, so you can stay up to date whenever we release a brand new episode on managing around. Stay safe, and I will see you on the next episode.
If you liked this episode, please leave a review on the Apple's podcast website. If you are not using an iPhone, there's a link in the show notes. If you've got any ideas or thoughts on this episode, or if you've got an idea about new podcast topics or questions you'd like to discuss, send an audio file or voice note to hi@profmanagement.de. For any non-audio comments, drop a tweet or a DM to @profmanagement on Twitter, please. Thank you for listening and see you next time.